Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, this is an unusual day for me. Actually for you guys too, because over at Nobbinway, Drew McLean brought the morning message over there, and Drew and I were talking about what to do, and he said he could continue with the God Quest series, and so I sent him some notes that I had from it, and I said, but really, Drew, you could just ask God what you should bring. I always think if God tells you what to bring, it's way better than what I tell you what to bring, right? So he did, and he said he was going to bring a message on hospitality, and he gave the title a little bit later, Stranger Love, and I said, boom. Are you having a hard time getting me here? Now we're good, huh? Okay, I'll just move that mic there. Anyway, so I said, well, that works with our One Another series that we've been doing all year, in and out, and being hospitable to one another. And so he said, oh, okay, great. And so I went. He gave me his title, and I looked at that, and I thought, So I did some of my research on hospitality, and the title made sense, so I went with his title too, and so. It's been good. We've been looking at, as you know, the New Testament commands of hospitality of one another, and so we've looked at so far the commands of serving, commands of loving one another, of praying for one another, encouraging one another, things like that. So today we're going to look at showing hospitality to one another, and only the biblical hospitality, and see what that looks like. And so we have this title, Stranger Love. And we're going to look into that, 1 Peter 4:9. But before we get to that, the fact is there's only 3 commands in the New Testament telling us about show hospitality. But I want to say, just because there's only 3 commands, it doesn't mean that hospitality isn't important, because it is important. In 1 Timothy, in fact, let me show you this. 1 Timothy, it tells us this. And this is talking about overseers, elders in the church. The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, and so on. And in fact, in Titus, Paul tells Titus, when he's giving him instructions, he says, for an overseer as God's steward must be above reproach, there it is again, he must not be arrogant or quick-tempered or a drunkard or violent or greedy for gain, but hospitable, a lover of good, self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. In other words, if a man isn't hospitable, he can't lead the church as an elder. That's what this says. How important is this command then? It's pretty important. Also, if the church is going to support a widow, I don't know if you knew this. If you're going to support a widow, being hospitable was a requirement, believe it or not. Understand, in the early church, in the first century church, there's no Social Security. So how's a widowed woman going to take care of herself? So the church has to help. And the widow's helpless and can't fend for herself. How many know that in the early church, in the early first century, women were second rate? And I'm sorry about that, but that's the fact. And hope we've gone from that, But Paul writes to Timothy, and he tells about this. People say, well, there's no membership in the Bible. Look at this. A widow has to be put on the list only if she is not less than 60 years old. Okay, so you got to be 60 first. And to be on the list, there is a list. They kept lists. They knew who was who, and they kept track of people. So some people say, well, no such thing as membership in the Bible. Here we have an instance where they are keeping track of people. We see that. And going on, he said, having been the wife of one man, having a reputation for good works, if she has brought up children, if she has shown hospitality to strangers, if she's washed the feet of saints, if she's assisted those in distress, if she's devoted herself to every good work, then you take care of her. Are you catching the importance of this hospitality in the Bible? So that's my intro. So let's get at it. 1 Peter 4:9, and it says this: show hospitality. This is a call to you and I. Show hospitality to who? To one another. How? Without grumbling. Huh? How you like that? You did what? You invited who? What? I can't. You know how I feel about that. Oh, man, that guy's a pig. He'll eat us out of house and home. Okay, his wife's okay, but he's not. Grumbling. Do it without grumbling. How's that working for you? How many know? Do we sometimes grumble when we're? Yeah. We sometimes do. It's really bad when the pastor's wife shoots up. But we do that. We do that. When we think of hospitality, we often think of having people over for a meal, pulling out all the stops, going all the way, going over the top, and maybe it involves an activity of playing cards or, used to didn't do that, play cards or watch a movie or play a ball game or something like that. Al and Lori Airbar, I thought, showed tremendous hospitality last week. Had a great time at their house, using their place to hold the baptism and membership service. It was wonderful. Our daughter Jessica, she went to Grand Valley. She graduated. I didn't know that you could do this, but she graduates with a degree in tourism and hospitality. So there are industries where hospitality is the key, restaurants, hotels, things like that. While all that is part of hospitality, one thing I want to try to convey to you today is that it's not biblical hospitality. It's hospitality, but not in the sense that we look at here in today. The Greek word for hospitality, when you look it up, is made of two words. The first is love, and the second is stranger. So it literally means love of strangers or stranger love, loving strangers. So when you have your friends over for dinner, it's not really hospitality in the biblical sense because it's not really stranger love. You know those people. It's loving your friends. And understand, I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that, get together with friends. I want to encourage you. It's always good to get together with friends and enjoy each other's company and all that. But it's not the biblical hospitality we're looking for. It's just not really biblical hospitality. It's love. It's love in 1 Peter 4:8. Above all, keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins. But it's not 4:9, which says, show hospitality to one another without grumbling. Now at this point, maybe you've read this before. At this point, maybe you're looking at this saying, well, Tim, I don't get it. We got a problem here. And as I was reading this, I thought, yeah, there is a problem, The problem is, these are one another commands that are to one another in the church. Right? So it's how we do things, how we do things in the church, how we encourage one another. I mean, you should know those people you're encouraging, people that you run with, the people, your posse, your family, your friends, your church. Pray for one another. You should probably know the people you're praying for. I mean, we don't always know all the people we're praying for, but praying for one another means I know my brothers and sisters that I'm praying for. But then when we come to this command, show hospitality, literally stranger love, it seems a bit odd to add this one to the one another command. You know what I'm saying? We tracking on this? How strangers can also be part of one another? How can strangers be part of the church? So I was looking at this and I decided here's how we solve this problem. So often we look at Scripture and we look at it in the micro. We look at the verse, we're trying to figure out what that verse says, but we have to look in the macro where we have to pull back a little bit. And you have to go back. Okay, man, I don't get this. It seems to conflict. What's happening here? So we pull back a little bit, read a few verses before, read some other verses, maybe some verses after to gain a sense of the whole thing that he's talking about. And when I do that, we flip back. We know that Peter is writing not to one church like a lot of the writers did. Paul wrote to Timothy. He wrote to Titus. He wrote to church in Philippi, or Ephesus, and Corinth, and so we wrote to one church. But here we see it's different. Flipping back to 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1, it says this: Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ. Okay, that's who I am. To those who are elect exiles of the dispersion. Okay, so these people who were forced to leave their area and move. Where did they exile to? To Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. So these people are exiled. So he's writing to a group of people in a bigger region, not to any one church. So doesn't it stand to reason that showing stranger love to brothers and sisters in the Lord are people you don't know? It's a little bit like CFC. We have two campuses. You may not know people over at Nobbin Way, but we're to show love to them as well. Even though we don't know them, they're part of us. And they don't know you, maybe. But you're part of them. And so that's how we work. He's calling for all of us, all the believers in a large region, to work together as a whole to love one another, even though they don't know everybody. Now understand, keep in mind, take America out of the context, and keep in mind in the first century, there weren't a lot of hotels, right? There weren't a lot of inns. They didn't have a Best Western. They didn't have a Motel 6, even though some hotels look like they've been around since the first century. But they didn't have a lot, and a lot of hotels or inns that they had were really brothels. And so they really weren't a place you wanted to stay. So if you were traveling, you needed to travel and get some different accommodations. So what he's doing is that when Christians travel, they try to avoid these places and stay with other Christians along the way. Maybe you've heard of, in the Mennonite church, we had Mennonite Your Way. Ever heard of that? Anybody? Jean Foss was part of that one time. She said she allowed her name to be in a book, and as other Mennonites were traveling, they could give her a call, and she would put them up. And likewise, if you had to join this thing, actually. Likewise, if you traveled, you had the book, and you could see somebody's here, and you could travel and stay with those people along the way. And that's what he's talking to do. When people came to town back in that first century, they come to the pastor in that town of the church, and they talk with them, and he would send them to your home. He'd send them to your home with the expectation that you take them in. Think about that for just a minute. Let that settle. They didn't have phones, didn't have text or email, and you didn't know they were coming to town. They didn't call ahead. If they wrote ahead, you might get there before the letter actually got there, right? And said Peter tells them how to receive them. How does he tell them? He said, do it without grumbling. So let's just take a look at that for a second here. It'd be really easy to grumble because without warning, you hear this knock on the door, and you're going, and you go to the door, and obviously they travel as they can, so it could be in the middle of the night, it could be early in the morning. And you go to your door to see who it is, and they say, hey, can we spend the night here? They tell you that we tend to church in Thessalonica, and we're on our way to visit family in Corinth. We saw your pastor, and he said, that would be potential grumbling, wouldn't it? I mean, wouldn't it just be like, oh, you're kidding me. I'm going to have that pastor. Yeah, Peter calls them to receive the strangers, even though they're brothers and sisters in the Lord, strangers into their home to love them, to serve them, and to help them on their way. Now, hospitality, how many know it's not easy? How many know that visitors are kind of like fish? They both stink after about 3 days, right? And biblical hospitality isn't comfortable, but it's a life that God's called us to. I think this is why Paul wrote to those in Romans, and he said this: while you're contributing to the needs of the saints, practicing hospitality. Use the word practicing, working at it, keep going, keep doing it over and over. And when Job was defending his integrity in Job 31:32, he said, but no stranger had to spend the night in the street, for my door was always open to the traveler. In other words, if there was a stranger in town, in the street, Job loved that person enough to invite them into his own home and spend the night. Imagine that. Now, my grandpa, my mom's dad, he would do that. Driving down the road, pick up a hitchhiker, not tell grandma, didn't have a cell phone, pull in the driveway, spend the night here at the farm. I know a certain Mrs. Miller that may not appreciate that if I did that. You know what I mean? And we did that one time. We helping a person out who needed a lot of help. And Kathy said, can we let this person stay at our house? I said, no. I said, no. I mean, I'm just fessing up, okay? I said, no. Kathy said, come on, this person needs our house. No. Why not? I said, we can't get him out. Once that person gets here, they're going to stay forever, And this person didn't live here. And so I told Kathy, okay, you tell the person that they need to leave by tomorrow noon. let them in, wash their clothes, take care. I was walking home from the barbershop. I could smell their car from 50, 60 feet away. And I thought, that's in our house. That's being washed in our washing machine, you know. That's sitting at our table. So I got in. I put my best pastor face on, you know. And we're talking, and that person spent the night. The next day I went to the barbershop, came home at noon. The person was still there. Can I stay another night? And I thought, I knew it was happening. I knew. and I just had to say no because I knew. And so I grumbled, okay? I grumbled, all right? But it's really hard to show. It is. How many know? I don't know what you guys are doing in that situation, but sooner or later, and I figured I may as well bite the bullet sooner than later, because later, you know, Mr. and Mrs. Miller wouldn't be happy either, you know, so we did that. Jesus talks about showing hospitality, and he really hits home hard with this. He said this in Matthew 25. He said, "For I was hungry." You know this. He had sheep and he's goats, and he's talking about sheep and goats. He says, "I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in." So a stranger could be Jesus in disguise. Right? In fact, Jesus said it's no big deal to love people who love you back. This isn't in your notes, but it's on a board. And he implied that loving those who don't is greater. He said this. Check this out. He said, "For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same?" You know, who's a tax collector? Tax collectors generally were Hebrew people, Jewish people, who were working for the Roman government, and they get their hands on your money, your taxes, and they charge you more than they should have, and kept some for themselves and gave the government. So they were Zacchaeus, tax collector. They were people you didn't like, people you couldn't stand. They were your own people who turned their back on you, which made it worse, right? So if you love those who love you, big deal. That's what he's saying. Big deal. Even the dregs of humanity that we see do the same thing. Big deal. Our tendency is, in our culture, to live in our space. I got my space, right? I think it's really true in our culture. We have the opportunity to create our own little space, and we don't want anybody getting into my space. I have my routine in the morning, right? I have this, and if I have somebody in my home, that messes the whole thing up. Doesn't it? And it's difficult sometimes. Now, there are some people, I know some of you are just plain incredibly hospitable. When I was, and some of you just take people in and just throw a meal together, and I'm just always impressed by that. I'm always impressed. Not all of us can do that. I remember when I was, we said yes, we candidated to come up here, and we said yes, and some of you were here when that happened, and I came in June. Kathy and the kids stayed, and Larry and Lonnie Wise took me into their home for weeks and weeks and weeks. I stayed there. Gene Foss was gone for 3 weeks, so she said, "Here, have my house." Now, granted, I hope you can trust your pastor, right? Yeah. You know, but still, it's a stranger in your home, and that was just a really blessing to me at those times. But not all of us can do that. Now, I know we're talking about ancient world, first century here. In the ancient world, understand they lived closer together. They didn't have cars. They didn't get in the cars and go someplace. If they wanted to go someplace, how'd they get there? They walked. So you're walking with somebody and your neighbor's out. You see your neighbor and they talked. They spent time with the neighbor. They didn't have to go watch the ball game. They didn't have to do the things that we do. You know, so by necessity, there was a greater degree of openness in their lives than there are for us. And today, things are just different. In our society, it means we want our privacy. So if we go travel, we get a hotel room, or lately we've checked vacation rentals. You know, especially if our kids are with us or something like that, because per night it's cheaper. But you know, so we want our own space. My mom and dad, when they came up to visit us, you know, they wanted to get a hotel room, not stay with us. And it just made sense because Dad had his scooter, and it was a lot easier to go into the hotel room than to come up some flights of stairs into our house, you know, and it just made sense. So sometimes there are practical reasons for that. But most part, we have friends that would come, they like staying in hotel rooms because they have their own routine, you know. If I want to go to bed early, I go to bed early. If I want to get up early, I get up early. Or get up late, I get up late, you know. But being private people doesn't remove us from the responsibility to show hospitality, stranger love. It simply means it's going to look a little bit different. After all, the writer of Hebrews gives us encouragement. He says this, let the love of the brethren continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by this some have entertained angels without knowing it. Jesus in disguise. So let's think about this for a bit. What's it mean for you and me to show hospitality? What's it mean for us to apply stranger loves to our lives? Maybe the best application, easiest application, the quickest one I can think of is here at church. You know, what do we do with visitors here at church? You know, visitors, if you will, they've come into our house. They're in our house, right? And there's situations when they come to visit us, it's going to be wide and varied. Some will be family that just come for a day or two, and we may never see them again. Some are just on vacation. We may never see them again. Some people, hopefully, are looking for a place that they can worship, and we want them to worship with us. That'd be great, you know. Others are in a crisis in life and just need to look for answers to some problems in life. Yet, all the different circumstances, the call is still the same. We're called to show hospitality. They're strangers. They're people we don't know, so we apply stranger love. So, I mean, know if you've ever visited a church, anybody ever go and visit another church? It's difficult sometimes, right? It's kind of like, oh, I'm fish out of water, you know, I don't know where I belong. And so, you know, it's difficult. It's a different building. It's a different people. It's a different way of doing things. So if you see somebody here, and keep in mind that it's different, we're different for them. If you see somebody here, go to them. You know, you're talking to your friends, talking to your buddies, drop them for a second, go visit the stranger, you know, and love them. Treat them like you would want to be treated at another church. I remember one time, Kathy and I went to visit a church one time. Nobody talked to us. We stood out, got a cup of coffee, they had coffee there, stood there. And it was the most unwelcoming, great service. But I tell you what, if you want to get me to come back, hey, how you doing? Good to have you here. Preaching and music can draw people, but relationships keep people. And you can't make relationships if you're ignored. You know. So treat them like you'd want to be treated. If somebody's ever here and looking for confused, maybe they're looking for the restroom, show them our restroom. Show them right over there. Thought it's over there. No. Show them the restroom. If somebody maybe doesn't have a bulletin in their hand and Tim is back here busy, go up, take them over to Tim and get a bulletin and get them if they're looking for other information. We got stuff back on the table. Get it for them. We got daily breads if they're looking for a devotion. Whatever. Get it for them. If they want a cup of coffee, say, let's see about getting you a cup of coffee. Whatever. How many know coffee makes people comfortable? Yeah. You have a little too much.
And let them have your seat.
Yeah. But, you know, we apply stranger love to these people. We don't interrogate them, you know, but we do need to talk to them and ask questions and stuff. Here's my hope. My hope is that anyone visiting us would go home encouraged by the love they experienced from being here as we extend love to strangers. The good news is, I believe you guys are doing a great job because I talk to people as I follow up with any visitors that I can. They say, oh, I felt welcome, I felt warmed. Over at Knobboy today, I heard the same thing over there too. And so I want to commend everybody for that. But we can't rest on our laurels. I want us to encourage you to excel even more in these things. But stranger love doesn't stop here at church. If you meet somebody new in the community and you discover something you have in common, follow up with that. Call them, invite them into your life. That's the key, inviting people into your life. And I'll tell you this, when you invite people into your life, understand it's going to be messy sometimes. It just is. It's just messy sometimes. And another reason that we do this is because our culture doesn't do it this way. When our culture sees us loving people this way, people we don't know, they'll think it's strange. And that's another reason it makes it stranger love, because it's going against the world, against the culture. And showing hospitality doesn't just stop with people coming to church. There's other ways. Remember the story of the Good Samaritan? Remember that story? Where Jesus talks about uses a Samaritan who attends to a wounded man who was beat up and pummeled, and he provided food and he provided lodging for him. He was saying that was stranger love. The Samaritan, using a Samaritan, which was, by the way, unheard of. The Samaritans were bad for the Jewish people, but he used a Samaritan. So you can seek to have strangers into your home. Try your neighbors. Maybe you don't know your neighbors as well as you should. Make it a goal to have some of your neighbors over for a meal, or just for dessert, or for whatever. Let me give you a theological reason as I close why you should show hospitality. Ephesians 2, verse 11 says this. Therefore remember that at one time you Gentiles in the flesh, called the uncircumcision by what is called the circumcision, which is made in the flesh by hands. Basically saying you non-Jewish people were, because of our tradition of circumcision, were not circumcised. That's all a physical thing. Remember that you were at that time separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. Remember, you were a nobody. You didn't know Jesus. You didn't have Jesus. Jesus came from the Jewish people. You were a zero. Remember that. He says, but now in Christ Jesus, you who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ.
Hallelujah.
Yeah, amen. Do you realize that to God, at one time before you said yes to Jesus, to God, you were a stranger to him, and he still loved you? It says in verse 12 that you were separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise. That is, we're separated from the promises of the Messiah. But now in Jesus, God has brought us near by the blood of Jesus. As we're all one. Because we were outside, we're now brought in. The command calls us to do the same. Show hospitality. Show stranger love to people. For people who are outside and are strangers, to bring them in. Leviticus, going back to the beginning, tells us this also. This is God talking. When an alien lives with you in your land, do not mistreat him. The alien living with you must be treated as one of your native born. Love him as yourself. For you were aliens in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. We were strangers and God brought us near. We should be hospitable to people. We should show stranger love to people. It's not the world's way, but it's God's way. Stranger love. Being hospitable to people, especially those brothers and sisters in the Lord that you don't know and I don't know.